Hello, everyone. Can you hear me? This is Julia Ramadan, your Zoom host for this session on social protection. As we admit people in and as everyone settles in, I just wanted to draw your attention to the housekeeping rules on the screen. I think we're all quite familiar with Zoom these days, but just a quick recap won't hurt as we wait one quick minute. Just wanted to make sure that everyone sees the interpretation icon at the bottom of the screen. We have simultaneous interpretation, so please make sure you select your preferred language and you'll hear the presentation in that language. So make sure you select the correct language that you prefer. And if you have any technical difficulties throughout the session, don't hesitate to type in the chat box and someone will come and support. So without further ado, I'll pass the floor to Sarah and enjoy this session, everyone.
Good afternoon. I would like to welcome everybody to this session. Thank you for joining us. We really appreciate your time, and we're sure that you've been participating in several sessions, and so we will make it as engaging as possible for you. So today's session is on social protection and safety nets, with the overarching theme of promoting social protection as an emergency response and recovery strategy for long-term resilience. And the format of the session will be an initial keynote, and then we will have different breakout discussions that will, there will be 3 different breakout rooms where we will get to the opportunity to hear from 3 different speakers about different best practices within this area, this thematic area. And then we'll come back to plenary and just have a closing of, a summary closing of what was discussed in each one, and some of the highlights of those best practices. So let me introduce to you, without further ado, our keynote speaker for today. We are very, very honored to have Dr. John Caballo present for us. He is the Regional IGAD Drought Disaster Resilience and Sustainability Initiative Platform Coordinator. Dr. Caballo has a PhD and has served various functions in universities, research, civil service, corporate management, and program development, as well as politics. So we can see he has quite the background for this. He's worked for a range of employers, and he is currently with IGAD in Djibouti, serving to coordinate the drought resilience platform. Dr. Caballo believes that the world is one ecosystem whose viability can only be guaranteed by the unity of mankind, recognizing the survival of each forms of collective obligation of all. And without further ado, we will go to his keynote speech and hear from him about the role of social protection for resilience and recovery. Thank you.
Natural or man-made disasters can strike anytime, anywhere, and create the urgent need for life-saving measures. Whether these life-saving measures are in the form of immediate short-term relief interventions in humanitarian assistance, such as food, medicines, water, shelter, money, and so on. All these measures can also be in the form of long-term investments to build resilience and emergency preparedness. Our region is beset by a variety of disasters: recurrent drought, floods, the recent desert locust invasion, the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, raging conflicts in various places, a host of climate change phenomena, including land degradation and desertification. All of these seem to be increasing in frequency, intensity, and complexity, and they are now being acknowledged as the new normal. By way of setting the scene, I was asked to introduce this afternoon's topic: promoting social protection as an emergency response and recovery strategy to build resilience. Now, while social protection has long been a domestic concern in developed countries, where sophisticated institutional arrangements have been created to provide assistance and protection to their citizens in times of need and emergencies, social protection has been largely lacking or rudimentary or inadequate in most of our developing countries, where the primary focus has been on economic growth. However, following the policy principles debate, you recall, which was initiated by the Development Committee of the World Bank, IMF, around the year 2000. The growing levels of insecurity and inequality caught the attention of the international community and soon became the focus of national level guidelines for good practice. The primary linkages between social protection policy and the strengthening of social cohesion, human development, and livelihoods in the context of equitable growth and good governance are easily recognizable. To understand the logic and necessity of social protection mechanisms as essential components in our strategy to respond to disasters and related shocks, it is important to understand the effects and impact that these hazards have on our population. In this connection, it is also necessary to acknowledge that the adverse effects of these disasters disproportionately impact the poor, the vulnerable, and the marginalized. The affected populations are often forced to adopt negative or ineffective coping strategies, which include undermining their livelihoods, destroying the environment, and degrading the ecosystem by overexploiting natural resources. It can include selling their productive assets, reducing their consumption levels, and making harmful investment choices. All these coping strategies will definitely impact the long-term well-being of the affected communities, and they will result in the near poor sliding back into poverty. And as the hazards continue to increase in intensity and frequency, so does the number of the poor and the vulnerable, all suffering and bearing the brunt of disrupted livelihoods, and all desperate and urgently in need of help. The poor and vulnerable members of the population are traditionally the beneficiaries of social protection programs and policies, as you know. These programs are designed to reduce overall poverty and vulnerability by diminishing people's exposure to risks and enhancing their capacity to protect themselves against hazards, and also against the interruption of loss of their income. However, as the population increases and as the disasters, especially climate-related extremes, also continue to increase, vulnerability increases and the efforts to reduce poverty become frustrated. Social protection mechanisms become overwhelmed and their intended effects are undermined, leading to a spiraling increase in poverty and vulnerability. To break out of this vicious cycle and reduce both the current and future vulnerabilities of the poor and marginalized in the context of the disasters, it requires solutions that strengthen the adaptive capacity of the affected communities. It requires solutions that enhance their residual ability to manage risks, and solutions that support them to recover from or withstand disaster-related shocks and stresses. Such solutions include a range of measures and intervention possibilities that provide consumption support during deprivation periods. They also include those that encourage investments in risk reduction measures, or that support livelihood diversification to adapt to longer-term changes in disaster variables and provide risk transfer products for better management of residual risk. When and if designed with specific risk considerations in mind, and when and if implemented in close coordination with programs that focus on strengthening livelihoods, promoting social inclusion, and applying early warning systems, social protection measures provide opportunities that enhance disaster resilience. Social protection can thus be recognized as an essential component of the critical strategy to reduce poverty, build resilience, and enable development. In order to deal with the root causes of vulnerability, stakeholders in the humanitarian system are often urged to make a fundamental shift from a reactive, insular, and competitive enterprise approach to one that is proactive, holistic, multi-sectoral, and partnership-based, which also anticipates risk and responds in strategic collaboration. In fact, current thinking does not advocate for a mere shift from one approach to another, but rather for a fundamental shift that will transcend the humanitarian development divide by working towards collective outcomes based on comparative advantages over a long multi-year time frame. The recognition of a humanitarian development nexus brings to the fore the critical role that social protection programs play in contemporary disaster response strategies. The major disaster response mechanisms that have been proposed and agreed in various fora, whether these fora are global, like the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development of the United Nations, the Paris Agreement on Climate Change, the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, or whether the response mechanisms are continental, like the Agenda 2063 of the African Union, or regional, like IDRISI, the IGAD Drought Disaster Resilience and Sustainability Initiative. All are programming frameworks that emphasize the need to build resilience to disasters and related economic, social, and environmental shocks through investing in sustainable development. These programming frameworks invariably include forms of social protection among their recommended measures and interventions. In the Sustainable Development Goals, for example, goal number 1, end poverty in all forms everywhere. Target 1.3 states, implement nationally appropriate social protection systems and measures for all. The Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction identifies the need to strengthen the design and implementation of inclusive policies and social safety net mechanisms. The Paris Agreement on climate change, on its part, calls for climate change adaptation action to follow a country-driven, gender-responsive, participatory, and fully transparent approach, taking into consideration vulnerable groups, communities, and ecosystems. Under priority intervention number 3 of the IDRISI strategy, productive safety nets are proposed for the chronically food insecure and for those graduating from food insecurity. Thus, the different programming frameworks recognize the need to make special arrangements to cater for the vulnerable groups, communities, or ecosystems. And these are targeted primarily because they are disproportionately impacted by climate and other disaster-related shocks. They require a range of interventions to help them strengthen their adaptive capacity to enable them manage the risks of the disasters that they face. Secondly, humanitarian interventions will enable the vulnerable groups to attain a level of recovery beyond which they'll be in a position to benefit from development interventions. It is now clear that if aid money is merely thrown at a disaster emergency-related program, without linking it to the recovery and resilience or self-reliance of the affected beneficiary, it will not be sustainable. It will simply be a means of creating and perpetuating dependency, especially in the face of recurrent disaster-induced emergencies such as food insecurity. Now, although resilience has now established itself as a dominant paradigm in international development and disaster response, permeating different sectors and programs, the profile of social protection on the development agenda is rising. It is not surprising that the rise of social protection is increasingly linked to the resilience agenda. From the disaster risk reduction perspective, the possibility of using social protection programs to deliver humanitarian assistance faster and more efficiently is increasingly being explored. We know that the resilience to any disaster cannot be built by one program or one sector alone. It requires the combined effect of a range of programs of interventions. Social protection programs need to be specifically designed to reduce vulnerability to disasters. Integrating resilience objectives into the theory of change of programs can increase the contribution that social protection makes to better respond to disasters. Considerable success has been achieved by combining humanitarian aid and support to the process of recovery and resilience building. The implementation of the short-term regional emergency response project, for example, this is an autonomous multinational project supported by the African Development Bank, which was recently being implemented in Somalia and South Sudan. This